Chapter 3 of Christ in the Rubble. Welcome, Lisa. Thank you. Chapter 3 is all yours.
Thank you. Okay. So chapter 3 is setting up the relevant context for October 7th and just Gaza specifically. And the quote at the bottom of the slide, it says, so this was in November 2023. Hillary Clinton was a guest on the American TV show, The View. When asked about a ceasefire in Gaza, she replied, "There was a ceasefire on October 6th. This was not ignorance. Clinton knows the history and the truth about the blockade, and that Gaza is still considered occupied under international law. And she also knew that she was propagating the myth that the war had started on October 7th. So just briefly covering the Gaza Strip, it's about the size of Las Vegas. It's got 2.1 million people in one of the most densely populated areas of the world. 1.7 million of them before October 7th were refugees living in 8 refugee camps. Many of them were only a few kilometers from their homes, which they could not return to. The refugee camps had miserable conditions to begin with. And from 1948 to 1946, the Gazans were stateless. They were under Egyptian administrative control, but as the territory was not annexed or considered part of Egypt, they were not considered a state or anything, actually. So just a territory. During this period, there was 4 months in 1956 to 57 where Israel occupied Gaza for 4 months. During this time, there were there were many massacres in the beginning few weeks to kind of get the area under control. 2 massacres in Khan Yunis on November 3rd, 1956, where 275 people were executed by machine guns in one day. 140 of them were refugees. And according to Israeli historian Benny Morris, life in the Strip's refugee camps and the Israeli occupation produced fanatical Israel haters. And he said specifically, he mentioned Sheikh Ahmad Yassin, the founder of Hamas, and his aide, Abdul Aziz al-Rantisi, were both child refugees during this time. Rantisi was an 8-year-old refugee in Khan Yunis at the time, and he had spoken about seeing hundreds being killed in cold blood. And that definitely left an impression on him. This occupation, even though it was brief, shaped generations of attitudes toward Israel and toward its occupation and toward its military. Then they had to pull out, but then after the 6-Day War of 1967, they reoccupied Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The UN Resolution 242 called for the withdrawal of Israel armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict, but yet they stayed there. They continued to occupy the Gaza Strip, West Bank, and East Jerusalem in spite of the resolution. And this kind of set up the pattern going forward where they could just ignore resolutions with no consequences. The author states that life at this time, they felt powerless yet united. And after 20 years of this, in 1987 to 1993 was the first Palestinian Intifada, the uprising, began in Gaza. The Israeli army killed at least 1,000 Palestinians, 237 were children, and at the same time, only 43 Israeli soldiers and 47 civilians were killed. It started when an Israeli army vehicle hit Palestinian cars containing workers, killing 4 and injuring 7. This led to a demonstration in the Jabalia refugee camp that extended to the rest of the Strip and the West Bank. There were peaceful marches, although some threw rocks at Israeli soldiers, and Israel responded with tear gas, rubber bullets, live ammo, curfews, and closing of schools and universities. The Oslo Accords brought some hope to the Palestinians. The Oslo Accords of 1993 and 1995 were based on the idea of a two-state solution, where Palestinians would gain independence and sovereignty over the West Bank and Gaza. But Israel continued and increased building settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And when nothing was done to stop this, then this led to the Second Intifada from 2000 to 2007. This was far more violent than the First Intifada. There were more than 4,200 Palestinians, 1,000 Israelis, and 63 foreign citizens killed. Israel assassinated Palestinian politicians and militants. And at the time, Palestinian militant groups resorted to suicide bombings out of a feeling of helplessness. The assassinations took place through targeted airstrikes and bombs. Most Hamas leaders were assassinated in Gaza, which made them folk heroes and increased the popularity of Hamas amid the failed peace and the corruption of the Palestinian Authority. Okay, so now Hamas is born right after the First Intifada, founded by Ahmed Yassin and his aide Abdul Aziz al-Rantisi. They considered it an alternative to the secular approach of the Fatah Party, because this was an Islamic political and militant group with the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood movement from Egypt. Their charter declared that the land of Palestine is an Islamic trust from God and sees no place for negotiations or peaceful talks with Israel. It's a religious movement rather than national movement, while trying to remain inclusive. Their charter states Hamas strives to raise the banner of Allah over every inch of Palestine. Under the wing of Islam, followers of all religions can coexist in security and safety. Okay. Their original charter in 1988 was written while there was a lot of upheaval. There were not, the leaders did not get together and really create this charter together. It was really written by one person, and it is still used today by opponents of Hamas to state how militant they are. Their original charter states, "Our struggle against the Jews is very great and very serious. It needs all sincere efforts. It is a step that inevitably should be followed by other steps until the enemy is vanquished and Allah's victory is realized." So in 2017, realizing that they wanted to be a little bit less, that they didn't want to lose the original wording because they still did feel that way, but I think they wanted to enter into negotiations, so they changed their charter to say Hamas affirms that its conflict is with the Zionist project, not with the Jews because of their religion. Hamas does not wage a struggle against the Jews because they are Jewish, but wages a struggle against the Zionists who occupy Palestine. There's the military wing of Hamas and the political wing. The military is the Izz-al-Din al-Qassam brigades that uses armed resistance with the aim of liberating all of historic Palestine. They consider it a holy jihad or a religious duty. They are seen as a resistance movement in Palestine, but they're seen as a terrorist organization in the West due to the suicide bombings that took place in the Second Intifada. They are popular because of the networks and charities, clinics, mosques, and schools that they had set up in Gaza and in the West Bank. And their perceived religious devotion is counter to the corrupt and elite Palestinian Authority. Let's see. Oh, and Hamas gets its name from the Arabic acronym for the Islamic Resistance Movement. So Hamas refuses to recognize the existence of Israel as opposed to the PLO and the PA, who have acknowledged its existence and looks for peace and coexistence with Israel. That's one of the main differences. The way that the Palestinian Christians see Hamas, they do not support the religious ideology, but they do not see the struggle as a religious one. They advocate for a state for all its citizens with a vision constructed on respect for religion, but also equality, justice, liberty, and respect for pluralism. They support creative nonviolence and condemn the killing of civilians. But they do see Hamas as a response to Israeli colonialism. And the author stated, if people are genuine in their desire to destroy Hamas, I suggest we begin by getting rid of the occupation and apartheid. So he does see it as a natural outgrowth of what happened, and that's really the only way to get rid of it, or to even deal with the issue that they're having. So in 2006, the Palestinian elections, Hamas won a majority of the legislative seats. They got 44% of the vote. Most were voting against Fatah. Fatah was controlled by a rich elite minority. So they were voting against the corruption, nepotism, failure of the peace process, and against the lack of leadership that they were getting from Fatah. Gaza was punished by Israel with the support of the West because they were blamed for the election, even though Hamas did not win a single majority in any district in Gaza. The PA would not give up control, so Hamas took over Gaza by force in 2007, and at this point, Israel announced a total blockade by land, air, and sea with the intent to keep Gaza's economy on the brink of collapse and thus dependent on external actors. During the blockade, and this is really the point he was trying to get to, was these last 16 years before October 7th. During this blockade, Hamas ruled Gaza with force. 2,000 Christians fled to the West Bank, or left through Egypt. They gained full control, investing in a military arsenal. They built tunnels to Egypt to bring in goods. Israel was virtually isolated Gaza in order to punish them and to keep complete control over them without being inside Gaza, without having any settlements there. And Egypt closed the Rafah border crossing with Gaza. There was merciless bombing during all this time, minimal food allowed in, just enough to avoid malnutrition. They kept increasing the list of prohibited items. They banned fishing rods, nets, children's toys, chocolate, space heaters, and musical instruments in an aim to stifle life and livelihood, while at the same time dropping bombs. They also aimed at the construction and garment industries, which were the key sectors of Gaza's economy before 2007, and they were the largest employers. So they would not allow in building materials, fabric, or any sewing machines. To make an already horrible reality even more atrocious, Gaza endured 4 wars. Oh, wait, sorry, that's the next slide. Leading up to October 7th, a majority of Gaza's children suffered from PTSD, but they actually had to change the name from post-traumatic stress disorder to complex continuous trauma to describe the never-ending warfare. They were kept on the brink of survival for 16 years. The world continues to call their suffering collateral damage. The context of hopelessness and despair, unemployment, food insecurity, youth suicides, and 80% of the children had depression. Israel used Gaza as its labor pool, granting work permits to tens of thousands of Palestinians from Gaza, mostly physical labor jobs in Israel, like construction and agriculture, leaving them no choice with the high unemployment in Gaza. Israel's National Security Council director asks, how many would pick up arms after witnessing such indiscriminate violence? And UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres in 2021 said, if there is a hell on earth, it is the lives of children in Gaza. So the world obviously knew what was going on. There was no secret. They weren't hiding anything. And we continued to fund Israel during all of this. So to make it even worse, Gaza endured 4 wars with Israel from 2008 to 2021. Less than 200 Israelis were killed, including soldiers, yet 5,000 Gazans were killed, over 1,000 of them children. They called it mowing the lawn. Israel military intermittently bombs Gaza every few years to wear down and reduce the population. They see no difference between citizens and resistance fighters. They use dehumanizing language. Like the Israeli Knesset member Ayelet Shaked openly called for genocide, labeling all Palestinians snakes. The next year, she was promoted to the cabinet as Israel's Minister of Justice. The Western governments unquestionably continued to support funding weapons to bomb Gaza and mow the lawn, as if this policy somehow protects the safety of Israel or stability in the region. And then quickly, just to mention Israel's role in October 7th, Israel funded Hamas in order to try to weaken the Palestinian Authority and keep them divided, using a divide and conquer strategy. Hundreds of millions of dollars were channeled from Qatar to Hamas. And in 2019, at a meeting, Netanyahu stated, anyone who wants to prevent the creation of a Palestinian state needs to support strengthening Hamas. This is part of our strategy to divide the Palestinians between those living in Gaza and those in Judea and Samaria. So then he just asks us to walk in his shoes. He says this history is not meant to be comprehensive. Much more could have been explored, including the 9 months leading up to October 7th of 2023, where a record number of Palestinians were killed just in that year alone, and a number of violent incitements and invasions of Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, which is why Hamas named its attacks on October 7th Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. So he's saying he does not endorse Hamas or the killing of civilians or claiming that Palestinians are innocent. He just wants the whole story to be told, since mostly it's coming from the other side. This context challenges the myth of a conflict where the colonizer is defending itself from the colonized. And he says, wherever there is oppression, there is resistance. Should we try nonviolence? He asks. Well, they tried nonviolent boycott, divest, and sanctions, which was vilified by the West, and the West launched a substantial political movement against it. Gazans conducted weekly nonviolent protests called the Great March of Return. Israeli forces killed more than 200 Palestinians during these marches and injured 30,000, overwhelming the hospitals, mostly with gunshots to the legs. So then, should we try diplomacy? The US is ready with its veto power, having vetoed 53 UN Security Council resolutions critical of Israel as of February 2023. And if they try armed resistance, they are labeled terrorists, as we all know. In his sermon on October 8th, Munther describes how they were watching their TVs, sitting in West Bank, watching their TVs, glued to their TVs. They were shocked by the strength of the Palestinian defiance. They knew that what happened on October 7th was the result of the injustice since the Nakba. He admitted that pressure generates explosion, and that anyone who had been following events up to this point was not surprised by what happened on October 7th. Gaza today is the evidence that humanity has lost its conscience. When he was speaking about the concert, this was before they knew that people were killed there, he stated, what a great contradiction between the besieged poor on one hand and the wealthy people celebrating as if there was nothing behind the wall. Safety doesn't come through walls, weapons, and money. Yesterday proved that, he said, meaning October 7th. Either we live together or we destroy each other. Peace is the key to security. Safety will only come with justice and equality. Our call today, meaning October 8th, was not to lose our humanity. Human feelings rejoice in revenge, especially after years of oppression, but revenge can damage the soul, leading to the cycle of endless violence. And he asks, today we are called to pray for the war to stop, to pray for the innocent, because he already knew a war was coming, and said, God weeps before death, and we too should weep with him. It's a very powerful sermon. If you read the whole thing, it's hard to summarize them. And that concludes my presentation.
Lisa, thank you so much, especially doing it. You did a fantastic presentation, and really in difficult circumstances. So I really, really appreciate that. You did very well.
Thank you. One thing that, he kept mentioning the 16 years before October 7th, but he really didn't go into it that much. The history was a lot before that. And then he talks about the blockade, but he doesn't give as much time as I would have expected from how he's saying that he was trying to set the stage for it. And yet I feel like a lot is missing. Like it makes me want to go and research more deeply about those 16 years in particular, because it had been hell all the way since 1948, but those last 16 years were kind of like the power keg, is what he's kind of saying. And I wish he would have set that up a little bit more.
You should have, you hope it, you're disappointed
Yeah.
didn't say more about that. You could have said a bit more about that. Yeah. I was just thinking about how, of course, the old declaration, Hamas declaration, is still being used against them, the way that they phrased it. I don't think that they even meant it the way that they meant it. I think they were just a little bit naive in their language. But the improved version, where they're talking about Zionism and they're not against all the Jews, and that's better. But what I'm interested in is that how many people are so critical. In fact, you don't have to say much to be sued or even potentially get arrested in some countries if you're even remotely suggesting that resistance is justified in a situation like that, which is, by the way, true by international law. Nobody's speaking Israel up on the fact that Israel is expressing, Israeli politicians, everybody is horrendously racist against Palestinians for being Palestinian. And the other thing, too, is nobody's speaking up Israel about the fact that Israel's citizenship is based on a racial definition of Jewishness. Israel is a racist state through and through. And everybody picks up on Hamas and complains about everybody else, but nobody says anything about Israel, and the world should have known. And also, you in your summary, you mentioned how Israel's been treating Gaza all this time from the beginning, and collective punishment, especially against the civilian population, is actually against this international law. Where is the world? Where is the world court? Where are the world courts? Where are the world's politicians to speak about that? And one more thing I wanted to mention that I remember that I might have said before here in a previous book. When I was a child growing up in Israel, when you wanted to say to somebody, go to hell, you just wanted to, you got annoyed with somebody, you wanted to go to hell. You wouldn't say go to hell, you'd say go to Gaza. So I'm 61 years old this year. And I'm talking about growing up in the 70s when I start to understand things. That's what you said. So that tells you that even back then in everyday society in Israel, people understood perfectly well how hellish Gaza was. And that was then. That's not the 16 years before 7th of October. That's what we used to say. Go to Gaza, lech le'Gaza, we used to say. Can you believe this? I mean, this tells you that everybody knew.